Hello, good people. It's great to be back with you. I'm really excited to come to you today to talk to you about what is going on Rebel Wisdom with the conversations on Plan B, especially since Paul Vanderklay said he's going to talk about it also on his channel. So I find this to be quite an interesting direction for this conversation. So we've been talking about philosophy and theology for quite a while, and now it seems like the conversation is really starting to get very practical, and I like that because I'm a very practical person. Okay, so the last conversation they had on Rebel Wisdom on this topic featured Jamie Wheel and a man named Douglas Rushkoff. Okay, I found that to be quite fascinating, especially the part where Douglas Rushkoff was talking about looking at the past and at other ways that people have managed or arranged their civilization and their economies and what we could possibly learn from them. Well, I'm all about that because I'm a Catholic distributist. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what distributism is. And that's why this series is called Can Distributism Answer Game B's questions? So I want to get started on that and do a little bit of an introduction to what distributism is. Okay, so a friend of mine is the author, Rod Bennett, said one time, distributism is more of a criticism than it is a system. And there's something to be said for that. So distributism is a way of thinking about economics that has certain principles, but it's not actually a system of economics. It lays out certain principles without saying exactly how or according to what programs or what laws or what taxation systems, etc. These particular goals, you know, the ideals or the goals of it ought to be met. And it's not saying how to get there, but what is the desirable goal. Okay, so that's one thing that to bear in mind about distributism, that that it's not laying out a particular economic system. The second thing to understand about distributism is that it has its roots in the Catholic understanding of man. So it's very anthropological in its thinking, and it's very family-oriented, family-centered. So that's something else to consider about it. Now, how did distributism arise? Well, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or once the Industrial Revolution really was in full swing, people were being taken from their land, from an agrarian way of life, into cities to work in the new industries that were powered. First, they were powered by steam, and then later on by petroleum. And people were going to work in these factories, and there were entire families that were put into the factories to work. Everybody was working. The parents and the children, as soon as the children were, you know, old enough to do anything in the factory, they would be put to work. And the living conditions that they had to live under in the cities were just terrible. And we've all seen pictures of this. We've seen pictures of these terrible tenements that people lived in, crowded, very conducive to having diseases. We know about the pollution. We know about the lack of fire safety. We know about things like the terrible conditions in the meat packing plants. You know, the author of The Jungle, can't remember his name right at the moment, who did the expose about that. I mean, these are things that we know in history. We've seen how these conditions were. We know that the labor movement came about to address many of those conditions. Well, in 1898, Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical, 1891. The encyclical was called Rerum Novarum, and it gave the church's vision for how how this new thing, that's what Rerum Novarum means, a new thing, this new industrial way of life, how it could be arranged in such a way that the workers were benefited. And so that was what the encyclical was about. And you can read the encyclical online. If you do a search for Rerum Novarum, you'll find a link to it on the Vatican website. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. Now, once the encyclical was written, a number of thinkers subsequent to Pope Leo XIII expanded on and thought about the practicalities of how the ideas in that encyclical could be put into law, they could be put into changes made in the way businesses were run, different things like that. So it has been a very fruitful line of thought for a number of years. You're familiar with some of the things that have come out of the thinking of Catholic Distributists. One thing is ESOPs, employee stock options. Those were a result of thinking of Catholic Distributists based on Pope Leo XIII's encyclical. Some other thinkers, very famous thinkers, that thought about distributism and wrote about it include G.K. Chesterton, Fulton J. Sheen, Hilaire Belloc. So these are all thinkers who expanded on this and had things to say about this, and had things to say that actually were taking from the past, from including the Middle Ages all the way back to the Middle Ages, and what we could learn, what we could be instructed by with the way that things have been arranged in Europe over the centuries since the fall of the Roman Empire and the changes in the economy of Europe that went through all that period. So these were people who really were looking at a wide expanse of history, a wide expanse of geography, and saying, okay, what are things that are working? What are the different ways that people are organizing themselves, and what could work, and how could we take ideas and apply them right now to an industrial age, or, you know, in our case, to actual post-industrial age, a technological age like we have. And so there's a lot to mine. There's a lot to discover in the thinking of these writers. Now, distributism, I would say, is something that has a number of common sense insights, and these insights then provide a foundation for practical thinking. So once you have the insight, then you can start to think practically about how you would achieve it. You can think about if you were going to, say you had an empty room in a house, and you wanted to figure out how you were going to furnish that room. The first thing that you would think about would be, how do I want to use this space? What kind of activities are going to happen in here? And once you know that, then you go, okay, now that I know what my ideals are, my goals are for this space, now I can arrange practically the furnishings that will support those things. So that is what distributism does. It doesn't say what the exact furniture should be, but it says what are the activities, or what are the goals for an economic system. So what I want to do, I could just sit and tell you what are the insights, these common sense insights that distributism brings to the table. But instead, what I want to do is just ask you some questions that will lead you to have the insight at the first major insight of distributism. That is the thing that I want to deal with, because there is one thing that is first and primary when it comes to distributism, and it is also the, I think, the most important foundational thing that distributism brings as an insight. So I'm going to do that by asking you a couple of questions. And you can just think about this and think about how you would answer this. Now, would it be okay with you if there was one person someone in the United States, one man in the United States who owned everything. And I want you to consider this, that he, in such a manner that he has acquired what he owns completely legally and completely without subjecting any other citizen to any undue pressure or force. In other words, he owns everything, but he owns it because he bought it. And he bought it because it was sold to him, and it was sold freely. But he owns everything. He owns everything. He owns all the land. He owns all the real estate in the country. So everybody who is on land or is a tenant on any kind of real estate is there as a renter from him or a leasee of his property. He owns the controlling interest, the controlling stock interest in all the companies. He owns the country, we would say. Would that be okay with you as long as he came by that ownership completely legally and without forcing anyone else to do anything? Or would you have a problem with one man owning the entire country? Now, if you think about a man owning an entire country, you would realize that what we're talking about when one man owns a country really is an absolute monarchy. But an absolute monarchy is not necessarily a terrible thing to live under. I mean, people have lived under absolute monarchies before. People have had very, happy and joyful and fulfilled lives and done their work and supported their families and, been born and had a happy life and died under absolute monarchies just fine. Not always, of course. Absolute monarchies can definitely go bad, but there have been many times when absolute monarchies have worked just fine. It kind of depends on who the monarch is, right? So what we're imagining in this case, though, is that even though it's similar to an absolute monarchy in the sense that one man owns everything, what we're going to say here in the United States is we're going to leave our Constitution in order. So we're going to still have the same political system and all of that, but one man owns all of the property or has the controlling interest in all the property. Would that be okay with you? And I will bet that you realize that there's something quite unpalatable about that idea. And probably what you think of is he would have a tremendous amount of power and you don't like the idea of him having all that power. So you would probably say that is not the way you would want things to be in our country. You would not want one man to own everything. Okay, then, if you don't want one man to own everything, what if we just divided the country up between 10 men? 10 men own everything, They have, they have the controlling interest in all the companies. They own all the real estate. They own, they own the railroads. They own the airlines. They own everything. Is that okay with you if it's 10 of them? You're probably still thinking, nah, that's, 10 men, if the 10 men own everything, it would feel to you like they would have an awful lot of power, wouldn't it feel that way? All right, well, what's 50 men? How about 50? Could 50 men own everything? What if there was one man that owned everything in each state? So just like your particular state, whatever your state is that you're in, one man owns everything in your state. Okay, with that, but we're saying still, your way of life goes on. It's true. You still live in the same house that you live in. It's just that he owns it and you pay him rent, or maybe he just came to you and said that he wanted to buy it and he had enough money and he said, you don't even have to pay me rent. You can still live in it. I'll just own it. So would it be okay with you if one man owned your whole state? Would that be okay? Well, what if it's not the state then? What if it's the counties? What if in each county one man owned the whole county? Would that be okay? Would you have a problem with that? What if it wasn't the county? What if it was each town? Like each town was owned, or city was owned by one person. Would that be okay with you? It'd be kind of like, Mr. Potter, when he had Pottersville, he owned the whole town, right, in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. What if one man owned your city? And let's say he was a very benevolent and nice man. He wasn't like Mr. Potter, mean and and dissolute and bringing things down. He really did a great job with the town, and everything was built up, and everything was good for people. Would that be okay if one man owned everything, as long as everything was good for everyone else? What would you think about that? You see, if you find these scenarios to be unpalatable in some way, it's probably going to be because you recognize that one person who owns everything actually has power over that thing, and actually has a certain amount of power over the people in the area where he owns everything. Even if he doesn't exercise that power, or even what power he exercises in a benevolent way, still he has a lot of power. And in our kind of government, in our kind of society that we're supposed to have here in the United States, it's supposed to be a representative democracy. And so one person is not supposed to have an overwhelming amount of power. This is the first common sense insight of distributism. Okay, so what Rerum Novarum did is give us the church's vision for the distribution of property, not in support of the rich gathering up all the property they can afford through a concentration of political and economic power, but the owning of property widely distributed among working classes. Now, in subsequent videos, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Right now, I want to talk about just a few comments from some of the subsequent thinkers that thought about distributism. And I want to just give you a couple of quotations from G.K. Chesterton on this. G.K. Chesterton said, "Property is the art of democracy." Okay? And here is another quotation from him. "One would think, to hear people talk, that the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers were on the side of property. But obviously, they are the enemies of property because they are enemies of their own limitations. They do not want their own land, but other people's. It is the negation of property that the Duke of Sutherland should have all the farms in one estate, just as it would be the negation of marriage if he had all our wives in one harem." That's G.K. Chesterton. Fulton Sheen, Bishop Fulton Sheen, he used to be on television. He was a very popular television preacher back in the 1950s to the 1960s. And he was a big advocate of distributism, and he was also a very big advocate, a very patriotic American. And he said this, he said, "Power follows property, and they who own things to a great extent own persons. Once you concentrate property in the hands of a few, you create slaves. When you decentralize it, that is, distribute it, you restore liberty." Now, a couple of other thinkers that are considered distributists are Father Vincent McNabb, who was an Irish priest. He wrote a book called The Church and the Land, and he's a very big promoter of agrarian distributism. And Hilaire Belloc. Now, Hilaire Belloc wrote a real serious classic in the area of distributism, and it's called The Servile State. Now, there have been a lot of economic changes and advances since Hilaire Belloc wrote The Servile State. But I still think that his basic line of thinking, line of reasoning and argumentation is one that we need to reckon with if we're going to think about how a game B situation might come to fruition. So what I'm going to do in my next video is I am simply going to outline what Hilaire Belloc's argument was regarding the servile state, and how we would know if we were in a servile state. Okay, interesting question. Until we are together again, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks for watching.